army and so on. Flying
So
around.
the other day we were coming up and there was a jet stream that looked like it was coming right out of the top of the mountain. The mountain came up and there was this incredible jet trail. It looked like it was just rising right out of the mountain. It was quite incredible.
Yeah,
I couldn't see the plane, but you could see the thing going. It was very wide.
It's called the Volcano Air Force.
Right. It's April 8th, 1989, and we're here talking with Lauriston Sharp, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Cornell University. We're here in sunny Santa Fe, carrying out a project sponsored by the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research and conducted by the University of Florida Anthropology Department. Lauriston Sharp is at Cornell and is in many ways the person perhaps most representative of Cornell anthropology. It was his first job, I guess, as a professional anthropologist in 1937, wasn't it, Lauren? 36, and has been there ever since, and was the founder of that department, if I'm not mistaken. How did you get that job at Cornell?
Well, it was a small founding because I came as an instructor in anthropology in the economics department. And it was a peculiar situation because the president of Cornell at that time, it was actually his last year, but when he interviewed me, he wanted to know all about Kroeber and Lowy and all these people, and it turned out he had gotten a PhD in anthropology at Columbia from Boas.
Good heavens, what
and
was
had
his
done
name?
Farrand, Livingston Farrand. Then later on, after doing work especially on California Indian languages, he got an MD and went into public health. He ended up as president of the American Red Cross, and it was World War II that shunted him into really medical rather than anthropological interests. And he got involved at Cornell and set up our medical college, which you know is in New York City. It's not up at that little isolated town of Ithaca up in central New York. And I don't think he had pushed for adding anthropology to the curriculum particularly. He kind of lost interest in it. He was still called himself an anthropologist, as I say, and he talked about Kroeber and Whistler and these other early Boas students that he'd been one of.
So I never knew that.
What really happened was that a demographer, the chap who set up the 400 million population of China, which was generally accepted as the population, that demographer retired in about 28 and was replaced by a Columbia demographer, a sociologist. And he had been at Cornell, you see, 7 or 8 years and felt the need for an anthropologist to go along with him. And he was in the economics department. That's why I went into economics. And the anthropology department wasn't set up until Edmund Ezra Day became president and pushed for an expansion in the social sciences. He'd come from the Rockefeller Foundation, the educational area, and felt we ought to have some anthropology, and set up a department of anthropology and sociology.
At that same time?
In 1939. It was 3 years after I came.
You had done research in Australia as part of your graduate training, and you got your degree at Harvard. Could you sort of talk a little bit about the Harvard situation at that time and how you got to Australia?
Well, I trained to work in Southeast Asia. This was kind of just a rational decision. It was either your area, Latin America, where there weren't many Americans in the 30s. You remember there were Norwegians and there were British and French and so on. And the other area that attracted me as being kind of neglected, there were a lot of stuffy Dutchmen and French, English, puttering around with ruins in Southeast Asia, but very few people working with the living populations there. Now, I thought Southeast Asia, you know, there it is, down there in the corner of Asia and kind of neglected. Maybe we need somebody in America who specializes. And I wrote Lowy and asked him where I could learn German and a little bit about Southeast Asia, and he told me to go to Vienna, where there was Dr. Heine Gelder, Robert Heine Gelder, who was about the only world anthropologist interested in Southeast Asia at the time. He was primarily an archaeologist. So I worked a year in Vienna after 6 months of field work in archaeology in North Africa with Beloit College, and then went to Harvard on the advice of Ralph Linton, whom I had known at Wisconsin, where I got my BA in Wisconsin.
That's right. Linton started at Wisconsin and then went to...
Well, he was at Chicago at the Field Museum and came up
that's right.
to Wisconsin. And he was having a hate-love affair with Radcliffe-Brown, who was by that time at Chicago. But he said, well, the department at Harvard is not great at the moment, but go there because their PhD will get you a job. So I went to Harvard. And the department was then Tazer, Maya specialist, Hooton, Ernest Hooton, physical anthropologist, and Dixon, who was just a walking encyclopedia of everything. He did American Indians, he did South Asia, or Asia, he did this, that, and the other. And I had only actually a year and a half at Harvard. They hand out an MA after 1 year. If you don't flunk any courses, you don't write a thesis. And in the middle of my second year, partly because Lloyd Warner was there, who later went to Chicago, and had been working in Australia, and partly because the Rockefeller Foundation had given a very large grant of money to the Australian government to set up an Australian National Research Council, which was almost brand new, and they had fellowships. And so Warner and Radcliffe-Brown got me a fellowship for field work, which I grabbed at once because it was the depths of the Depression. And this fellowship gave me, it's 400 pounds Australian then a year, which is about $1,600.
That was,
I knew I would be eating wallabies the next year or two, and it wasn't going to cost me very much, and that was why it was worked out. So here I was, a fledgling anthropologist out on a salary, actually, doing my field work on a salary. So I took ship to Australia and headed right up north.
Touch any interesting ports of call on the way?
The inevitable Honolulu and Samoa. We had a day there and a day in Fiji, of course. It was a long trip. I went out with George Devereaux, and he was, of all things, heading for Indochina, just where I wished I was going.
Was Devereaux a student also at that time, or was
I think where did he get his degree? At
I can't remember.
Berkeley, I think. I'm
maybe,
not sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, we ran into each other soon after we took off from Los Angeles on this steamer. You see, it took 30 days to get from the United States to Australia in those days.
Yeah. Had a long time to make the cultural transition.
Right, right. So we had a good time, I remember.
How did you get out to the Ururant?
Well, by a coastal steamer. The Ururant are up in the northeastern corner of Australia, in Queensland, in that big thumb-like Cape York Peninsula that sticks up towards New Guinea. And you go from Sydney on up by a boat that's headed for Singapore and get off at a little place called Thursday Island, where Captain Cook had originally lived. Right next door is Possession Island, where he grabbed the continent from the British Crown. And when I was at 72 or thereabouts on his first trip. And then I came down from there, down the inside of that peninsula, on the western side of it, where there were only 4 mission stations and about 900 miles of coast. And I went to an Anglican mission, having arranged it with the bishop up at Thursday Island, and put in there for about a week, and then got outfitted. I brought along a lot of stuff for equipment, and then headed into the bush right away from there. It was a sudden transition.
I would guess, yeah. And were you alone on this, or did you go with a guide, or how did you get down there? Was there transport or horse, or what was the
from Thursday Island down to this mission along the coast? I went on a mission lugger, a sailing boat. It took us 11 days that time because the winds were not very good. But this was a little, about a 30 or 40 foot two-masted lugger, a yawl, which carried supplies in, and this was its first trip of the season, so we were loaded with flour and sugar and rice and that sort of thing. Because the only other access to that mission station, which was right near the coast, was over very flat, swampy land, and that road didn't dry out. A road from the south, coming up from the south, didn't dry out until I got there in late May, and it wouldn't dry out until June. So here there was this mission which had been isolated for 6 months. No contact with the outside at all.
So you worked out of that mission station essentially?
Well, no, I went up and established a camp about 2 days north of the mission station, but and farther than that, away from the next mission station north, which was a Presbyterian mission. So there was this big, long coastal strip with still 3 or 4 ethno-linguistic groups of Aboriginals, including the Yit-Yurat, living in the bush, influenced, of course, by the 2 missions. But actually, the group I was with, it turned out, were in revolt against the mission. And they were a little ambivalent. They sent their children some of their children into the mission school, but many of them simply would not deal with whites. They were fed up with whites. And you've got that sort of thing sometimes here in the Southwest. A group will say, nothing doing, we're going to stick to ourselves. And these 300 or 400 Yit-Yurat were in that condition. And they didn't come into the mission until World War II, when the Australian government pushed all Aboriginals into settlements. They were living in the bush as they had. And the only real supplies they got from the mission, for instance, they got a lot of lecturing and ideas and so on, sermons and whatnot, but the only real supplies that they were dependent on, and they really were dependent on it, was tobacco, trade tobacco. And they were hooked. They were drug addicts from way back. Strong stuff. I ran out of my own pipe tobacco later on for about 3 weeks and had to smoke this stuff, and I just went around woozy like this all the time. And they would trade fish and food, meat products, that sort of thing, to relatives who would then take it into the mission if the mission wanted it. But the mission was running a cattle station and had 1,000 head of cattle. So usually it was the other way. The missionary would send up to me occasionally some salted beef.
Yeah, so you were out with the Yit-Yurat
and I didn't see a white man all for the next 3 months.
Yeah.
I was out there, I know nothing about language, and I took along with me a young man about 20 years old, a little older than that, who had pretty good English. The missionary had refused to let them use pidgin English, which was the language all up in northern Queensland and into New Guinea, of course. But that particular form of English he was down on, and so this chap, he was illiterate, he couldn't read, but he had quite fluent English, and Yit-Yurat. And that was the way I had to start. Now, I had had no training in linguistics at all at Harvard, and that was shocking. How do you write this stuff down?
Yeah, you didn't.
I went back to a high school French course, and I remember there were open O's, and there were closed O's, and there were long O's, and I put a line over the top, and that's it. But when I brought my field notes back to a real linguist, namely Charles Hockett at Cornell, he gave up. He said, well, I can't tell whether this language is tonal or not. And I said, well, it's tonal, but not in the sense that Siamese or Chinese are tonal. And in general, my field notes were not useful, or haven't been useful, until finally we trained at Cornell a young PhD, Barry Alfer, who went out and did his thesis on the Yit-Yurat language. And he'd been properly trained by it. But I had no linguistics until I got back from Australia in the summer of '36. Sapir was a visiting professor in the summer school at Harvard. And I rushed into 2 of his courses. One was personality and culture, and the other was elementary linguistics. And it wasn't until then that I learned some kind of an international phonetic system. And that was really awful. Harvard was sending these people out without even having thought about language as such, which I think is the most scientific branch of anthropology, except maybe archaeology, and a branch which obviously should have been included in any field training or any training for anthropologists, cultural anthropologists.
Yeah. So and looking at it, how did your general study there in the Yit-Yurat was what, a general ethnography intended to be?
Nobody knew anything about these people. It was empty on the map, and that's why Sydney and the Australian National Research Council people thought that's where I should go. Radcliffe-Brown, by the way, to get a little history into this thing, was by that time in Chicago, and on the way to Australia, I stopped off in Chicago and had a day with him, and he told me how to conduct field work. Well, of course, you know, it turned out he'd conducted field work mostly from a mission veranda or from cattle stations or something out in West Australia. But this was very helpful nevertheless, and of course I knew Lloyd Warner very well. He'd worked again out of missions up in North Australia. I didn't learn until quite recently that I was one of the first 6 people who the present Australian anthropologists now define as having worked with Aboriginals beyond the settlements. They didn't count Lloyd Warner as having worked beyond settlements. He worked at a settlement, and Radcliffe-Brown had, and others had. So that there were very few of us who had gone out to live with people who were still self-subsisting.
Yeah, and living with them
supporting.
in effect in the
Right.
camp.
And there wasn't enough known. Nobody knew what kind of a kinship system was up there. That was, of course, important in those days. And so you just got dumped into this place and told, as I was saying the other day about Malinowski, do everything. Collect everything you can. And that was it.
So the most famous thing, I think, generally for everybody in anthropology is your steel axe case. I think it's hard to find an undergraduate major or even any undergraduate who hasn't been exposed to that.
We could forget it. There were other things besides steel axes in that trade
They were going in that, yeah. How did you come to write that article? And,
well, that was after we'd set up the anthropology program at Cornell, and Ned Spicer, who was at Arizona then, was a good friend of Alex Layton, who was in our anthropology program. Dr. Layton had been trained in medicine, but was also had worked with the Navajo and was very much interested in, I suppose we'd call it medical or psychiatric anthropology now. And so we brought him to Cornell as soon as we set up our graduate program in anthropology right after World War II. And by the 1950s, we'd planned this series of publications. We were doing a summer training school here in the Southwest with John Adair and Alex Layton in charge. And Adair and Bunker, as you remember, did a book on that training school that went on for, what, 4 or 5 summers.
It was a First Look at Strangers, I think it was called.
That's First Look at Strangers, and it was a very good book. This mixed group, there was I remember an Egyptian girl one summer, along with my Thai student that had come back to Cornell to get a higher degree after I'd worked with him for a year in Thailand, and a mixed group, including 1 or 2 American students, and they would be brought down here to interview and deal with 2 or 3 Pueblo groups, as I recall, or Navajo, and the Indian administration people, or other people who, on the government side, so that was treated as one of the 3 or 4 cultures they were to deal with, to try and get some experience of during the summer seminar.
So we had bureaucratic culture as well as native.
And that, of course, was popular then. As you remember, there was the Westinghouse study, and people were studying public administration in anthropology in those days. So that this was a sensible thing to give these people.
Yeah. Could you go back a little bit and talk about sort of pulling together the anthropology department at Cornell in the late 40s, how you got that orchestrated?
Well, as I say, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, no, they were polite. I think it was Anthropology and Sociology.
Alphabetical.
Was set up. I was the only person in it by that time, an assistant professor or something. And the head of it, the man appointed as chairman, was then a well-known among sociologists and social psychologists, a well-known psychologist named Leonard Cottrell, who later went down to the Sage Foundation. And he was an excellent chairman. And we got off for a couple of years there and got started. We had good classes. I remember in introductory anthropology always had a couple of 100 students.
Yeah, let me say something about it. I remember when I was your teaching assistant one year.
That was after the war.
That was a long time later. But your course is very famous, and everybody, all the graduate students I know, look forward to having the opportunity to be your teaching assistant. And I remember the first day of class, you stood up front and said, I want all of you students to go over to Willard Straight Hall and look for this. I've forgotten the Latin, but I remember the English translation. He says, look around Willard Straight Hall and you're going to find the motto of anthropology on the wall. And it would say, nothing human is alien to me. I don't know whether you remember that, but I was very impressed, and sure enough, all the students were running over to Willard Straight Hall to find this drawing on the wall of the student union.
That must have been, no, that was the cultural anthropology.
That was the cultural anthropology course, yeah. But I know you were always known as a great classroom teacher, and and a great inspiration to students.
This man Cottrell, as I say, was chairman, and we got off to a good start. He was very sympathetic to expanding the anthropology eventually. The first thought was to bring Lloyd Warner to Cornell because they knew, the president knew Warner and admired him. But we knew him too and thought that this was very unfair to Cottrell, who'd been appointed the year before as chairman, to bring Lloyd in, who said he would not come unless he were chairman. So the sociologist who brought me to Cornell and Cottrell and I said nothing doing. And so Lloyd did not come, and by the next thing we knew, the war came along, and all my colleagues disappeared towards Washington. Cottrell went down and did some very important work for the Army, especially on race relations. Remember, the blacks were not integrated into the armed
Cornell
forces.
had that interest that continued.
That was his interest, you see. He was one of these opinion-type people. And the sociologist who brought me to Cornell went into the Office of War Information. He never came back to Cornell because Roper grabbed him. And he was Roper's #2 man after the war. He died in the early 50s, but until then he was running the Roper thing. That was their interest, but it was a kind of anthropology in a way. I remember talking even before World War II about mass observation. Does that mean anything to anybody these days? Tom Harrison, you know, the Borneo anthropologist, and a British sociologist called Madge had set this organization up in 1937 of people, you interested in this? Sort of people who would sit around taverns or pool halls or whatnot in Britain and just talk to people, and then they'd come home and write all this down, what people were thinking, or they'd write it down in front of others, and then they had a whole corps of people who'd go through and do, in essence, a content analysis of these informal interviews in taverns and public houses and so on, and then report into the government or some research outfit what the British public was thinking. And there weren't any polls in those days. This was the way you knew whether the government disliked Hitler or didn't. You weren't worried about it and that type of thing. And so I can remember our discussion, do we want to go in for mass observation? And Cottrell and Woodward, the sociologist, said, no, we do sample work. And you can take a few thousand people and get a whole mass of opinion that is much more accurate than any of this mass observation stuff. And sure enough, of course, mass observation collapsed under its own weight. It was a very complex, difficult kind of thing to handle the data in that sort of operation. But they were aware of that type of thing, and where does the department go, including anthropology. Then there was this postponement during the war.
Right.
I had to stay, and that's when I first became chairman of the department, because there wasn't anybody else around. And I remember we hired Francis Shue.
You didn't trundle off to Washington, or?
Well, I'd had several offers, but who was going to keep the home fires burning was the sort of thing. And the president deans just said, no, we can't let everybody go. The whole thing will collapse. You stay here if you can, and all your colleagues are down there. And so we got along, as many departments did during World War II. We had a very good statistician, Louis Gutman. Many people will know the Gutman scale, which Louis wanted to call the Cornell scale, because he'd invented it after he came from Minnesota to Cornell. And he was working with Cottrell in this Army project, but he would come back to Cornell by railroad in those days, of course, and 3 days a week, and teach in the department. And as I say, we hired Francis Shue, we hired Marty Young, a year at a time, and struggled along. And then by 1945, there were a lot of people, especially concerned with Southeast Asia, OWI and OSS, so on, that were trying to get me to come down to Washington. And so I had quite a choice by that time, the end of the war, towards the end of the war, and decided on the State Department. I wanted to know how that ran, whether it had any influence in policy or was what it was. So, we had the striped pants picture. It was,
so you did do things with the State Department there.
So then in 45, early 45, I went down and stayed 2 years with the Division of Southeast Asian Affairs in the department. Finally, I was acting head of that department. It was a very small group. Again, we had people coming in. The Indonesian specialist from Yale, not going to be able to call up his name at the moment, would come down one day or sometimes 2 days a week, and we would sit down and plan out a position paper, you see, and then I'd stay down and write it. He'd okay it the next week, and we'd try to send it up the line, not with any success, because, of course, these places we were concerned with, except for Thailand, were all colonial places.
Yeah.
So that you couldn't make a move on what should the United States be doing in Indochina. Should we bomb their coastal railroad, or shouldn't we, to keep the Japanese transportation offline, without an okay from the French desk and the French embassy? The department couldn't decide things like that. We couldn't. And the same, of course, for Burma and Malaysia, Borneo, most of Borneo, and Indonesia. These all had to go through the European desks. And they didn't know, the Europeans on those desks didn't know anything about Southeast Asia. I mean, there were 3 or 4 active people in the Dutch embassy. None of them had ever been in Indonesia, and yet we were trying to make decisions. Should we put a secret force into Indonesia to fight the Japanese if we can? The Dutch were down, and some of them in Australia, wanting to get back, and that type of thing. And there was just absolute ignorance as a basis for making decisions. It was terrible. We did, I think, fairly well on Thailand. We had a good man named Ken Landon, who had been a missionary in Thailand and spoke the language and all very well. So we had a free hand in a way on Thailand. We could make, and it was we who decided that we would not declare war on Thailand when they declared war on us. The British declared war back and got into grave difficulties after the war on that, trying to make peace. They had to make peace. Yeah. So that was the Southeast Asian experience. I jumped at it because that's what I'd always wanted to do. And the Australian Aboriginals didn't seem very important in World War II. As I say, they were all dragged into missions or other settlements. And that was really the end of field work with self-sufficient Aboriginals. Australia,
Second World War. I didn't realize
they were. Well, the other thing that surprised me was when I went back to Australia later in '57, how frightened the Australians had been of a Japanese invasion. And later on, they've claimed that there were real plans for an invasion. What Japan would have done with the whole continent of Australia, heaven only knows. But these people, well, no, they wanted the North Coast as a protection from our bombers and all that. And if it hadn't been for the Battle of the Coral Sea, they would have landed in Australia. And so an Australian anthropologist, Bill Stanner, was put in charge of 5,000 men to protect North Australia against the Japanese. It would have been hopeless if it had happened. Empty coasts, and not just this Cape York Peninsula, but all around it. The whole northern coast of Australia, just really empty land.
So after the war, then, when you went back to Cornell and began working there again, you began adding more anthropologists to the staff.
Well, I went back just convinced that something ought to be done about this situation of not knowing areas. There had been the beginning of peasant studies. Remember, John Embry had done a Japanese village in the late 30s. Redfield was interested in villages in Yucatan, studying peasants. You didn't have to go out to wild tribes and mountain people and swamp livers and so on. You could go to a peasant village and be an anthropologist. And that idea had soaked into anthropology. And of course, in Southeast Asia, the 85% of the population were peasant farmers. And nobody knew much about them. What few anthropologists had worked in Australia, there were 1 or 2 German, in Southeast Asia, 1 or 2 Germans, had worked with hill tribes. They were exotic, fancy headdresses and all that. And I got out to do some research in Thailand in 1948 and discovered that the Thai government had no idea what it cost a Thai farmer to raise a ton of rice. Knew nothing about it. And I said, well, let's let the hill tribes rest for a while and get on with these peasants. So that was when we started this village study in Thailand. And we had the Bang Chan study. It was a village just outside of Bangkok because we wanted, in part, to see what influence these westernizing urban changes that were obviously going on in Bangkok might have out in the country. And that was really the first move in the direction of a Southeast Asia program at Cornell, the Thailand project, and then in 1950 we set up a Southeast Asia program, which went along with, we decided, other Asian programs and the Latin American program. Now we're talking about anthropology. We had decided right after the war to get Alex Layton there. He met him in his various research work that Gutman and Cottrell and so on had been doing. And so Layton and I sat down to plan some kind of anthropology program for the PhD. I had told President Day before World War II, when he wanted to start this whole thing and get Warner there, that there were half a dozen, 6 or 7, major anthropology graduate departments in the country. And in my private opinion, that was enough. They represented Chicago, represented the Radcliffe-Brown functionalism. Penn was not as strong as it had been, but it represented strong archaeology and museum studies. Harvard was Harvard, Yale was Yale. There was still good anthropology, of course, at Michigan and at California. And that was enough. It would supply the need for PhD, which in anthropology was, as it is now, largely academic. And he was shocked at this. You don't think you got anything special to offer graduates in anthropology? But I had changed my mind, you see, when I came back after the war. Here we were monkeying around with these peasant colonial countries. We weren't sure they were not going to be retained as colonial countries. Whatever Roosevelt said, Churchill was saying something different. And that we ought to, somebody in the United States ought to be training somebody to know something about such places. And so we thought out this anthropology program to study change, and as you know, brought in Alan Holmberg to do Latin America, Maury Oper on India. I stuck to Thailand or Southeast Asia, and Alex Layton, and then John Adair was brought in to join him in work here in the Southwest, especially.
So John Adair was there.
He was an instructor.
Yeah, an instructor on the staff.
Yeah. So we brought in essentially a 5-man, wasn't it a 5-man department? There was myself, Oper, Layton, Holmberg, and Adair.
Yeah, yeah. So
and we decided that went along with the decision we aren't going to do the Near East. We aren't going to try to cover Africa. These were important areas, but we better not try to do everything. And the result was that we got 1 or 2 so-called area and language programs going. As you know, Alan started a South American program. And that was against the advice of the Rockefeller Foundation, which was giving us some support. They wanted him to have a country. You should choose Mexico or Guatemala or a country in South America. Put all your, well, we didn't think we could train people, that there would be enough people who all wanted to work in Guatemala, say, to set up such a program, and that we better, sure, concentrate on Peru as we did, but be able to do the Andes at least.
Yeah,
so
broader
that's
scale.
Broader scale. And Maury decided the same thing about India. Not just do northern India, but do the Tamil country if we could. And we got people on Sri Lanka who could do the languages, Tamil and Sinhalese, and set up these area and language programs to give thorough, in-depth training in the first social sciences and later moving into the humanities in these regions. I should say that Cornell had a good China program, and that was being developed at the same time.
So you had these specialists. The other thing that, of course, Cornell quickly became known for and perhaps the first department in the country, was its applied focus and encouragement in many ways.
Well, applied anthropology was in the air then. Remember, the Society for Applied Anthropology had really just been founded at the beginning of World War II, in 1940, I believe, and in Washington. But the war came along, and Margaret Mead went here, and
everybody was scattered.
Yeah. And so that bit of a start on applied anthropology got dispersed during the war. Then after the war, what about applied anthropology? Here was President Truman announcing his .4 program. Many people have forgotten all about that, but the idea was we would go out and teach those little brown brothers how to really plow fields and plant rice and do all the things that they're so poor in doing. And that was when my God, he doesn't know beans about, but they're going to send these engineers and agriculturalists and medical people out there who know even less about Indochina and Indonesia. And people didn't know where these places were even in those days. We're so much better educated, especially, unfortunately, about Vietnam, than we were then. And so the idea was not just applied anthropology, but let's learn something about these places so that we don't send people into a void to make mistake after mistake after mistake as they actually made, as we know. And that then got labeled applied anthropology. Actually, we set the thing up as, sure, the technologists and the physical scientists, the medical people, the nutritionists, agriculturalists, and so on, really ought to, from our point of view, get some social science help, because they're going to be working primarily with people before they're able to deal with these physical problems. And that was where the anthropology and the social sciences generally came in. And the area programs, of course, were designed as multidisciplinary social science programs. And the anthropology program was designed primarily to look at social change, not just in tribal societies, but peasant societies.
Essentially, they were being the majority.
Peru, India, and the Navajos, we didn't really call them peasants.
Yeah, but so the program began to produce this sort of worldwide kind of scope within it. And,
but with you got to know your area. The student ought to know his language before he goes out. I was very insistent on that because of my experience at Harvard. And of course, in Latin America, it was easy, Spanish.
Yeah, or Quechua. Of course, we had the Quechua program developed later.
Yeah, and
Cornell
we taught Quechua.
Yeah.
And of course, there was a good deal of feeling about that. You will know much later on, there came the question raised particularly by John Mora, the Andean specialist, who felt that we had made a grave mistake to teach Spanish in an Andean village, that we should have taught Quechua and made them literate in that. Whereas Alan Holmberg argued, no, they're going to, we don't want to hold them in this village. If we teach them only Quechua, then they're stuck in the Andes, and they have fewer options than if they learned Spanish. Wasn't that his argument?
Yeah, his argument was essentially they had to defend themselves vis-a-vis the national system. They had to understand it and be able to deal with it, and you just couldn't do that in Quechua. In fact, at Vicos, this whole idea of teaching in Quechua arose several times, and the community, in essence, rejected it because they said, look, we already speak Quechua, we want to learn Spanish.
Right.
And that was how that came about, essentially. But also, all of this was, at that time in the 50s, nobody was doing this sort of teaching in the native language sort of thing. This is something that came along much later, it seems to me, as I remember.
Well, we were fortunate to get Sola there, who was interested in Quechua. And then, of course, in the Southeast Asia thing, we did all the vernaculars, everything.
Well, you had Bob, I remember Bob Texter in the Thai project when I was a graduate student. He came back, and all the other graduate students were in awe. You know, he'd already written these health manuals for Thai workers. And
fluent in Thai.
Absolutely fluent in Thai, and I was very impressed by that. How did Cornell University as such respond to this kind of sort of international scope, and more than that, it's kind of the activism of the department in a way of training people to become active persons? How did they respond to that?
The administration was strongly pro-internationalism, and we always had quite large delegations, you may recall, of foreign students there, not so many from Latin America perhaps, but for instance, we'd always had strong relations with China before World War II even, and many Chinese students. One reason I decided on Thailand rather than anywhere else in Southeast Asia, there were more Thai graduate students from Cornell than from any other American university. And so there was a good group in Thailand with whom one could start work, or who would help you. So that the international side was recognized, and librarians were helpful and all that. Where we misjudged things, we did, down in the Arts College, did not have the power structure to influence at Cornell state colleges in agriculture and home economics, which housed nutrition, and some of the other technical schools. Many of the foreign students you see, came not to learn Western philosophy or political science, but came to learn engineering, agriculture, nutrition, architecture. The architecture college had lots of foreign students in it. Those technical schools. And they just went on their own sweet way, still assuming that, you know, if cattle people in East Africa have trouble with their cattle, we'll go out and we'll cure the cattle. And we would say, yes, but you know, people have cattle, and you don't know anything about that sheep program down on the Navajo reservation in the 30s and what trouble they got into when they went to barging around to take care of the sheep in a technical way without paying any attention to the Navajo. Oh, well, no, the disease, cattle disease is a cattle disease. We know what to do. And the engineers the same way. If you need a bridge, you put a bridge in. And we know how to build bridges. And we never got to them in 20 years, really. And only now, I think, are the physical sciences catching up and realizing that, sure, they've got to do.
Well, of course, as I remember, as a student, the rural sociology department within the ag school there and the so-called the upper campus of Cornell had a lot of people in it who were sort of attuned to that too. Now, of course, I think the rural social department at Cornell has several anthropologists as faculty members.
Right.
Milton Barnett, for example, was one of the early Cornell PhDs.
And they call it development sociology.
Yeah, and it's it's international focus. Frank Young, another Cornell anthropologist.
A rural sociologist is now head of the International Studies Center, Coward, irrigation specialist.
Take a short break.
Good.
Good time with the bells.
Yeah. Was that loud enough?
Oh yeah.
Clear enough and all that?
Oh, the mic is fine.
Good.
Yeah, we're going to try to follow up here in a minute.
Content is spectacular.
We may be animated slowly.
Well, kind of.
We got plenty of tape. If your voice holds out, we got plenty of tape.
Where do we go now? We've got to start it.
Yeah, we got ourselves started. I was thinking, you know, we could talk about some of these projects. You might want to talk a little bit about the whole pie thing subsequently a little bit with, you know, the Southeast Asia business with Vietnam and the whole thing and how Cornell people got into that, or is that...
That's not anthropology.
Not anthropology.
Political science,
anthropology
too to some extent.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know the continuation of the pie business. Well, we had so many people working in Thailand and Jay Ingersoll and where was that, Laos and Cambodia, and there were a whole lot of folks trained in this area that Cornell was really became the area which produced probably the biggest set of knowledge in this area, whether you want to develop in that or not. The other thing I thought we might...
There's another problem I'd like to emphasize, especially with our auspices as they are, namely financial problems. You see, one of the things I'd hoped in Thailand to do much more with the medical, but we had no volunteer medical man, and we had to hire a Thai, and we didn't have the money. We got a junior fellow who was kind of out of a job, and he wasn't grade A. I can't say that on tape. And one of the problems was that Alan was costing this general anthropology project so much. You know, his budgets would go up and up and up. And Maury and I then were say, well, yeah, that's important. You've got the darn, you have to pay that rent on the place and all that. So, and you got it going, so we'll put the money in there instead of in here. And that was one of the administrative problems.
Yeah, we're getting the whole thing funded on a equal scope. Yeah.
Well, it wasn't a matter of just equality. It was enough to do that kind of work. We were in over our heads, really.
Yeah.
And we should have had more funds. For instance, Alan shouldn't have done so much administrative work. He should have hired a manager.
Right, that was one
And
of the,
I felt that very strongly. I was trying to run a department, run a Southeast Asia program, and run a Thailand research project. It was just crazy. And teach. We never thought about not teaching. Now, of course, people with these jobs, well, teach one course a year, and that's all right. Then you go out to wherever you want the rest of the time.
Yeah, no, you all were teaching. I remember, you know, there didn't seem to be any break there at all in terms of what people were doing. The various kinds of things that you saw happening in Thailand and in other areas.
Are we on?
Are we on?
Yeah, I just started right
now. Okay. In terms of getting, you got Bob Texter, for example, doing the health studies in Thailand, which were probably very early, or one of the earliest kinds of things of that nature that anthropologists got into. Were there other projects of that nature that got going in the area?
Well, we worked very closely with the Ministry of Agriculture out there. They had been trying to produce better varieties of rice, not with the intensity that came later with the work in the Philippines or with your maize work in Mexico, or potato work, I guess, also in Latin America and South America. But the problem was that the Ministry of Agriculture, again, had no conception of, sure, we develop a better kind of rice, but how do we get it out to the farmers? They had no extension type of work, you see. And a small group of anthropologists couldn't do very much there. We monkeyed around in this village of ours with different varieties of rice and persuaded some people to try them, but they knew what their rice would do, and they were not interested in being experimentalists in rice production. They had traditional methods which were effective. Thailand, you see, has never known starvation, and in essence that was the picture. We've never starved. Why should we try to produce even more rice? We've got a surplus, we sell it, we get some cash. There was the revolution of rising expectations, but they didn't see rice as the answer to that. And so we did relatively less experimental work of that kind than we had originally expected to do. We did look very closely in the Thai project to nutrition, and we brought a Cornell nutritionist out in our second session out there, Dr. Hazel Hauk, and they made nutrition studies and brought Thai students back here to get degrees in nutrition. And of course, anthropology entered heavily into that sort of thing.
Would you say that? Well, let me put it this way: of the various projects that you were involved with there, which ones were the most successful, and which ones were the least successful?
Well, the Peru project was clearly the one that hit the headlines,
right.
And you would be much better positioned to judge its long-term effects than I would. It was certainly carefully planned. It was not as autocratic as many people thought. They thought Alan would sit down and make decisions, and then that would be what happened. And this is not the case. He was very careful, as I understood it, to present alternatives. That then raised the question that you've got to educate people to choose the alternatives intelligently. A peasant with a limited horizon just isn't able to make intelligent choices when his choices are going to be related to the outside world about which he knows very little. So you've got to try to get literacy in and get them reading and get them to have a bigger picture than they've had before you can expect them to decide, and yet you're bound by this assumption that we applied anthropologists make, that the people changing have got to make the decisions to change. We can't do it for them.
In the Thai and the Southeast Asian area, what sort of successes or lack thereof did you see in terms of the things that your students and others were doing? Did you have a...
Well, there wasn't so much applied anthropology work done actually by our students, partly because of the we knew even less, perhaps, about what went on in Thai villages. We had to find out our northern villages different from southern villages. Well, we knew the southern villages really were Malay and Muslim and not Buddhist, but you didn't have a picture. So a great deal of time, frankly, was ethnographic. Mm-hmm. You were filling in blank spots, and the hope was you would build up a picture of this country, which is now, what, 55 million people.
Yeah.
Which is a very different thing, as I was saying last
very
time,
much
from
bigger
a tribe or anything else.
Yeah.
And the government was constantly coming in, and then, of course, the big thing was the United States government, with its millions being poured in each year in technical aid, a lot of which made more defense sense than otherwise. That is, we were frightened of China and frightened of Russia, and we were building roads in Thailand with China and Russia in mind instead of a Thai farmer in mind.
Yeah. No, that whole thing. If you know, looking back, if you were to, know, if you knew then what you know now, what kind of things would you done differently in working in that region?
I think you would have set up field expeditions to Washington, D.C. That was where persuasion was needed. We should have devised and thought more about reaching the physical scientists, I think.
You think we're doing that well now, or?
I just don't know. I think medical anthropology has made real advances, and I'm excited about what medicine is, research in medicine is producing that the anthropologists can use in understanding illness, understanding disease, they're different, and coming in to help the strictly physical side of it. And that, of course, is true also in other areas. This case, I don't know too much about it. The Balinese irrigation, where the International Monetary Fund people felt the irrigation on the island of Bali in Indonesia was not efficient. The distribution of water was decided by essentially religious figures up in the center of the island, and the technical people from outside said, well, it's impossible, they can't do this efficiently, they can't do it right. Until this young student from University of Southern California came along with his computers and found out that this was very efficient, it couldn't have been done better. And yet the outsiders, you see, were ready to redo the whole thing and set up new irrigation channels and get the water distributed efficiently when it was being distributed more efficiently. And that kind of message it takes a long time to get that across.
Yeah. Do you see any ways that we could do it better?
Well, I wonder about the anthropologists, having had this kind of experience, doing more in their universities to give training in methodology and the problems of working in a foreign culture. I have not had much luck in that. In the area programs, the area and language programs that are interdisciplinary, you see, I have close contact with students outside of anthropology, namely the historians, the political scientists, the economists who are heading in that direction. And I find they just aren't interested in this kind of question. How do you get along with the people? How do you know how to elicit information? Because it's not the way you do it at home. You've got to have special skills, special knowledge in order to really make sense out of the kinds of information you're going to get. What do you accept? What do you look at with skepticism and that sort of thing? And maybe we should do more of that. The problem would be to get recruits to come into such courses. I mean, if you set up a methodology course for all disciplines, anybody going to work in South America,
cross-cultural methodology or something,
you aren't going to get much business because people aren't going to believe it. Again, there's still this assumption that, no, if I'm a good nutritionist, that's all I have to have. Anywhere in the world, nutrition is universal.
Right. We all eat, don't we? Yeah.
And we need so many vitamins, whether you're in China or where, and so you just go and find out, and then you provide the vitamins, and that's all there is to it. And but you can't explain that in advance. People learn it eventually. And there is, as I say, certainly a slow drift in the direction of taking human beings into more account. Technical problem.
Well, I know, and we go through this in our campus too, trying to figure out how we can develop more effective communications with people in the more technical departments. And we've tried to get our students to go over and do things in those departments. And I think we have had some minor influences here and there, but it is very difficult. In terms of choice of problems to steer students into and training for this international type of activity and area, what kinds of things do you think ought to be emphasized?
Well, I think medical anthropology is one of the fields where you feel the need most: starvation, malnutrition, and so on and so forth, and diseases that are spreading hither and yon. And it is a field where the practitioner has to deal with people. That's what he's healing people. He isn't healing road systems or crop production and that type of thing. And so there you've got that human element built in. Now the problem is that you have to know more and more medicine to be able to practice. And maybe we should do what, are you aware of a chap named Connor who got his PhD in anthropology at Harvard a few years back and got fed up with anthropology alone, so he went and got an MD, 4 years or more, I don't know, whatever it was. He is now at Embry in the anthropology department at Embry University in Atlanta, and he runs a column in the New York Sunday Times magazine. He doesn't always write it, other people do, on what is the title? The mind comes into it.
Okay,
but he's as the other Embry people are very much interested in cognitive psychology, cognitive anthropology, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And there is a man who's devoted a good chunk of his lifetime to training to work with any human being who happens along, whether he's Chinese or American, black, white, or pink. And I think there's going to have to be more of that. I think there's been a tendency, a natural one, because of the pressure of problems in applied anthropology to do the quick fix.
Yeah.
You've got an irrigation problem. Gee, they're really going to need a crop next year. Let's do something.
Yeah.
And things are more complicated. Does that seem to make sense?
It does to me. This is the kind of thing that we've been sort of trying to do in Florida.
But it's not very exciting, you know, to tell a young student who's
It means investing a lot more time.
already saying, well, you mean I've got to spend 3 years doing Chinese just to learn to speak it, and then I've got to become literate with 10,000 characters in Chinese, and then I've got to do medical degree, and then...
Yeah, that's kind of hard to do.
And yet I'm sure that's where we need more interdisciplinary work. In the meantime, I think we can simply try to be missionaries for you're dealing with humans. Pay attention to the human side of the problem.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, appreciate the time that we had to spend up here on this pleasant roof.
Isn't it?
Isn't that nice?
Not even a worry about rain. Not even a worry.
We've been talking with Lauriston Sharp. My name is Paul Doughty, University of Florida Anthropology Department. That close us off here.
Yeah, you left yourself out of this picture. Well.